Sometimes the most unexpected choices lead to the most profound transformations. In a forgotten frontier town, a lonely sheriff's life was about to change forever when a mysterious girl walked in with nothing but hope and determination. Sheriff Thomas Wade had seen plenty of drifters pass through Millbrook, but none like the small figure who appeared at his doorstep that dusty afternoon. Her clothes were worn, her shoes had holes, but her eyes held something he hadn't seen in years: pure, unwavering faith. When he jokingly offered her any horse from the town's herd, expecting her to be overwhelmed by the magnificent stallions, she surprised everyone by pointing to the smallest, scruffiest donkey nobody wanted. What seemed like a child's foolish choice would soon reveal itself as wisdom beyond her years. As the girl and her unlikely companion formed an unbreakable bond, the hardened sheriff found his carefully guarded heart beginning to soften. But what secret was this mysterious girl hiding that would change the entire town forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Millbrook, a town that had seen better days, but still held on to its dignity like an aging gentleman in a well-worn coat. Sheriff Thomas Wade stood on his office porch, watching the dust settle from the girl's arrival, his weathered hands unconsciously fingering the tarnished badge on his chest. The badge bore two sets of initials engraved in careful script: T.W. and M.W., a daily reminder of promises kept and love lost. Thomas was 53 years old, though the mountain air and honest work had been kind to him. His hair showed silver at the temples, and lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into the sun, watching over a town that had become more family than duty. But those same eyes held a distance that hadn't been there 15 years ago, before consumption took his Mary and left him with nothing but memories and responsibility. "Well, I'll be," came a voice from behind him. Martha Henley, who ran the general store with the efficiency of a field marshal and the heart of a mother hen, had stepped out to witness the spectacle. That little thing actually picked old Samson. Thomas turned to study the girl more carefully. She couldn't be more than 12, maybe 13, with brown hair that caught the light like autumn leaves, and a face that seemed to hold too much understanding for someone her age. She was kneeling beside the donkey now, whispering something in his ear with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd spent considerable time around animals. "What's your name, child?" Thomas called out, his voice carrying the authority that came naturally after 25 years of keeping peace in frontier towns. "Hope," she replied without hesitation, though something flickered in her expression, a brief shadow that passed like a cloud over the sun. Hope Miller. The donkey, Samson, had been a source of gentle mockery in Millbrook for the better part of 3 years. He'd wandered into town during a particularly harsh winter, half-starved and stubborn as a mule, which, Thomas reflected, he technically was, being half-mule himself. Every attempt to ride him had resulted in the rider meeting the ground with considerable force and wounded pride. But now, as Hope ran her small hands along his neck, Samson stood perfectly still, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for exactly this moment. "Where are your folks, Hope Miller?" Martha asked, stepping closer with the kind of careful approach one might use with a skittish colt. Her own children were grown and scattered to the four winds, and her maternal instincts never fully settled. "Don't have any," Hope said matter-of-factly, the way children often delivered earth-shaking news. "It's just me and Samson now, I suppose." Thomas felt something twist in his chest, an old ache he'd thought he'd buried with Mary. The girl's composure in the face of such profound loneliness reminded him uncomfortably of his own practiced stoicism. He'd perfected the art of keeping the world at arm's length, but watching this child do the same thing struck him as fundamentally wrong. "Well, you can't just—" Martha began, but Thomas raised a hand to stop her. "The jail's got a spare room," he said, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. "Clean bed, good roof. You can stay there tonight while we figure things out." Hope's eyes widened, and for a moment the careful mask slipped enough to reveal the frightened child underneath. "You'd do that? Even though you don't know me?" "Millbrook takes care of its own," Thomas replied, though he wasn't entirely sure when he'd decided she qualified. "Besides, Samson's going to need somewhere to stay too, and the jail's got a small corral out back." As if understanding every word, Samson let out a soft bray and nuzzled Hope's shoulder. The girl laughed, a sound like silver bells that seemed to brighten the entire street. Several other townspeople had emerged from their establishments to witness this unusual transaction. Old Pete from the saloon stood in his doorway, wiping his hands on his apron and shaking his head in amazement. The banker, Mr. Whitmore, watched from his window with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. "I appreciate your kindness, Sheriff," Hope said with a formality that seemed oddly adult. "Samson and I won't be any trouble." "No such thing as no trouble," Thomas replied, but he found himself almost smiling for the first time in months. Just different kinds of trouble. As they walked toward the jail, Hope leading Samson by an improvised rope halter, Thomas noticed how she moved with quiet confidence through the town. She nodded politely to each person they passed, as if she were a dignitary making a royal progress rather than a homeless child seeking shelter. More peculiar still was how she seemed to take in every detail of the buildings, the layout of the streets, even the condition of the boardwalks, as if she were cataloguing information for some future purpose. The jail occupied a corner lot on Main Street, built of solid stone that kept it cool in summer and reasonably warm in winter. Thomas had added personal touches over the years. A rocking chair on the porch, flower boxes under the windows that Mary would have loved, and a small vegetable garden behind the building. The spare room had originally been intended for a deputy, but Millbrook had never quite grown large enough to warrant 2 lawmen. "It's not much," Thomas said, as he showed Hope the room. It contained a simple bed, a washstand, and a wooden chest for belongings. Sunlight streamed through gingham curtains that Martha had sewn years ago in a fit of domestic enthusiasm. "It's perfect," Hope said, and meant it. She set down a small bundle that seemed to contain everything she owned in the world. From the bundle, she carefully extracted a worn leather journal, holding it as if it contained precious secrets. "Thank you, Sheriff Wade." "Thomas," he corrected automatically, then wondered why he'd done so. He hadn't invited casual familiarity in years. That evening, as Thomas prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, he found himself listening for sounds from the spare room. Hope had settled Samson in the corral with water and fresh hay, then disappeared into her quarters with barely a sound. The silence felt different from his usual solitude, less empty somehow, as if the house itself knew it sheltered more than one soul. Through the window, he watched Hope emerge to check on Samson one last time before full darkness fell. "Beshu." Donkey greeted her with obvious affection, and she stood for a long moment with her forehead pressed against his neck. In that gesture, Thomas recognized something of his own relationship with loss, the way grief could make you cling to whatever remained. Later, as he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, Thomas reflected on the day's strange turn. For 15 years, he'd maintained the careful routine of a man who'd learned to live with loneliness. He rose at dawn, made his rounds, settled disputes, filed reports, and retired to a house that echoed with memories. It was a peaceful life, if not a particularly joyful one. Now, with the soft sound of a child's breathing drifting from the spare room and a donkey snuffling contentedly in his corral, Thomas felt as if he'd somehow stumbled off his well-worn path. The sensation was both unsettling and oddly exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the wind call you forward. Inside the spare room, Hope sat by the window writing in her leather journal by moonlight. Her penmanship was precise and mature, forming words that would have surprised anyone who assumed her to be a simple frontier orphan. When she finished writing, She carefully tucked the journal beneath her pillow and touched the silver locket that hung around her neck, a habit that brought her comfort in moments of uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the kindness she'd been shown. But tonight, for the first time in months, Hope fell asleep feeling safe, and Samson dozed peacefully just outside her window, as if they'd both finally found what they'd been searching for. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when the telegram arrived, carried by a young rider whose horse was lathered with sweat and whose face bore the grim expression of a messenger bringing bad news. Thomas was sharing breakfast with Hope, a simple meal of eggs and bacon that had somehow felt more substantial with company, when the urgent knocking rattled his door. "Sheriff Wade," the boy panted as Thomas opened the door. "Got an urgent wire from Denver. The station master said to bring it straight to you." Thomas took the yellow paper with steady hands, though something in the boy's manner prepared him for trouble. Hope watched from the kitchen table, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, as if she could sense the shift in the morning's peaceful atmosphere. The message was brief and devastating. Millbrook Township, notice of land seizure. Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company exercising eminent domain rights. Payment of outstanding municipal debts required within 30 days, or surrender of all township properties for railway expansion. Legal proceedings to begin immediately. J.P. Davidson, Legal Counsel. Thomas read the telegram twice, his jaw tightening with each word. 30 years of frontier life had taught him to face trouble head-on, but this felt different, like watching an avalanche bear down on everything he'd sworn to protect. "Bad news?" Hope asked quietly. "The worst kind," Thomas replied, sinking into his chair with the telegram clutched in his fist. "Railroad companies calling in debts the town can't pay. They want to tear down Millbrook to build their line through the valley." Hope set down her fork with careful precision. "How much does the town owe?" "More than we've got," Thomas said grimly. "Been struggling since the silver mine played out 2 years ago. Most folks are barely scraping by as it is." Within an hour, word had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Martha Henley closed her store and marched directly to the jail, her face flushed with indignation. Old Pete followed close behind, still wearing his bar apron and muttering curses that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush. Dr. Morrison, who served the town's medical needs with dedication if not profit, arrived carrying his medical bag, as if he could somehow heal this financial wound. 30 days, Martha said, shaking her head. 30 days to find $12,000 or lose everything our family's built? "It's not right," Pete declared, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "My father built that saloon with his own hands after the war. Died defending this town from raiders in '78. They can't just take it away." Thomas felt the weight of their expectations, their trust, their desperate hope that somehow their sheriff could fix what seemed unfixable. For 25 years, he'd solved problems with patient investigation, fair judgment, and when necessary, decisive action. But this enemy couldn't be arrested or reasoned with. It was progress itself, rolling forward with the inexorable force of iron rails and legal documents. "What can we do?" Dr. Morrison asked, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd spent 40 years fighting losing battles against mortality and now faced another kind of death. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, the words tasting bitter as medicine. "Railroads got the law on their side. Towns signed those promissory notes back when everyone thought the silver would last forever." Hope had been listening quietly from the corner, but now she stepped forward with the kind of determination that seemed far too large for her small frame. "There has to be something," she said. "People don't just build towns to abandon them." "Easy to say when you're 12 years old," Martha replied, not unkindly but with the weariness of someone who'd seen too many dreams die on the frontier. "World's harder than it looks from where you're standing, child." "Maybe," Hope said, meeting Martha's gaze without flinching. "But I've seen plenty of hard things already." And I know that when people care about something, they don't give up without a fight. Something in her voice made Thomas look at her more carefully. There was steel beneath that soft exterior, a quality he recognized from his own reflection during the darkest moments of his life. This girl had faced loss before, real loss that left scars on the soul. "What are you thinking, Hope?" he asked, using her name deliberately to show he took her seriously. "I'm thinking that 30 days is enough time to learn a lot about a problem," she replied. "And maybe enough time to find a solution nobody's thought of yet." Outside, Samson brayed softly from his corral, as if adding his voice to the conversation. The sound somehow broke the tension that had been building in the room, reminding everyone that life continued even in the face of catastrophe. "Well," Pete said finally, "the girl's got more fight than some folks twice her size. Maybe we should listen." Over the next several hours, as news of the railroad's ultimatum spread through every household in Millbrook, Hope made herself quietly useful. She helped Martha calculate exactly how much money each family might be able to contribute. A depressing exercise that yielded less than $2,000, even if everyone sacrificed everything they could spare. She assisted Dr. Morrison in organizing his medical supplies, asking thoughtful questions about which families might need credit for medicines if times got harder. But it was her conversation with old Pete that yielded the most interesting information. "A railroad company?" she asked as she helped him inventory his liquor supply. "They've been planning this expansion for a long time?" "Few years now," Pete replied, grateful for the company and the help. "Started surveying through the valley back in '89. Funny thing is, old man Whitmore, the banker's brother who died last spring, he used to talk about how the railroad would be good for business. Said they'd make Millbrook a proper stop on a line, bring in more folks, more trade." Hope's hands stilled on the bottle she'd been wiping clean. "The banker had a brother." "Sure did. Big shot with one of them railroad companies back east. Used to visit every summer until he took sick. Real gentleman, always tipped well and treated folks with respect. Shame when he passed. Seemed to have real affection for our little town." That evening, as Thomas made his rounds through Millbrook's quiet streets, he found Hope sitting on the jail's front steps with Samson's head resting across her lap. The donkey's eyes were half closed in contentment, and Hope was stroking his ears with absent-minded gentleness. "Penny for your thoughts," Thomas said, settling beside her with a grunt that reminded him he wasn't getting any younger. "Just thinking." "About what old Pete said," Hope replied. "About the railroad man who used to visit. Seems strange that his brother would be the banker in a town the railroad wants to destroy." Thomas considered this. Men can disagree, even brothers. Business is business. "Maybe," Hope said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Or maybe there's more to this than we know." Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, a lonesome sound that seemed to echo the mood hanging over Millbrook, like a funeral shroud. "Hope," Thomas said finally, "I appreciate you wanting to help, but this isn't your fight. You just got here." Hope was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she might have fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Sometimes the most important fights are the ones that aren't really yours. Sometimes that's what makes them worth fighting." In her lap, Samson sighed deeply, as if he understood every word and approved completely. And for the first time since reading that devastating telegram, Thomas felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. In the days following the railroad's ultimatum, hope seemed to appear wherever help was needed most. Thomas would find her sweeping Martha's store before dawn, carefully arranging merchandise with an eye for display that impressed the older woman. When Dr. Morrison struggled to reorganize his supply room, Hope appeared with organizational suggestions that would have done credit to a hospital administrator. "That girl's got a head for business," Martha confided to Thomas as they watched Hope efficiently sort inventory. "Suggested I move the patent medicines closer to the front counter. Said folks like to see remedies when they're feeling poorly." Sales picked up 20% since yesterday. Thomas nodded, though something nagged at him about Hope's easy familiarity with commercial practices. Most frontier children learned practical skills, farming, animal husbandry, basic crafts, but Hope displayed knowledge that seemed more suited to city life or formal education. His suspicions deepened when he discovered the hand-drawn map hidden among Hope's few possessions. He'd been checking her room while she was out with Samson, not from distrust, but from the protective instincts that had awakened the moment she'd chosen that stubborn donkey. The map was crude but detailed, showing not just Millbrook's main street but outlying properties, creek beds, and even elevation markers that suggested considerable familiarity with surveying techniques. "Hope!" he called when she returned from helping old Pete repair a loose board in his saloon's porch. "Can you come inside for a minute?" She entered the jail office with Samson trailing behind her, a habit that had developed over the past week. The donkey seemed to sense when serious conversations were about to occur, and positioned himself protectively near Hope's side. Thomas spread the map on his desk, watching her face carefully. "Found this among your things. Want to tell me where you got it?" Hope's expression didn't change, but she was quiet for several seconds too long. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful tone of someone choosing words with extreme precision. "I drew it," she said simply. "I like to know where I am. This shows property boundaries, creek beds, even some elevation marks." Thomas pointed to specific details. "That's surveyor's knowledge, not something a 12-year-old girl picks up by walking around town." "I'm good at noticing things," Hope replied, "and I'm 13, not 12. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Thomas had spent enough years questioning suspects to recognize evasion when he heard it. Still, Hope's secrets didn't seem dangerous, just deeper than he'd initially suspected. "Where did you come from before Millbrook?" he asked gently. "Really?" Hope's hand moved unconsciously to the silver locket at her throat, a gesture Thomas was beginning to recognize as a sign of internal conflict. "Does it matter? I'm here now, and I want to help." "It matters because I'm responsible for you," Thomas said, "and because I care about you. That's what people do when they care. They ask questions." The simple honesty in his voice seemed to crack something in Hope's composure. For just a moment, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a 13-year-old girl who'd been carrying too heavy a burden for too long. "I came from Denver," she said finally. The people who raised me, they died in a fever outbreak last winter. I heard about Millbrook from—" She paused, seeming to realize she was about to reveal more than intended. "I heard it was a good place, a place where people looked out for each other." It was partially true, Thomas sensed, but only partially. The hesitation before "the people who raised me" suggested a more complicated family situation than simple orphanhood, and her knowledge of Millbrook seemed too specific for casual inquiry. Still, pressing too hard would likely drive her away, and Thomas found he couldn't bear that thought. Over the past week, Hope's presence had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Mary's death. A sense of purpose beyond mere duty, a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. "All right," he said, folding the map carefully. "But Hope, if you know something that might help the town, I need you to trust me with it. Whatever secrets you're carrying, they don't have to be yours alone." Hope nodded, though her expression suggested the conversation was far from over in her mind. "I understand, Thomas. I need to be sure about some things first." That afternoon, as Hope helped Martha inventory bolts of fabric that might need to be sold to raise money for the railroad debt, she demonstrated knowledge that continued to puzzle the older woman. "That's good quality wool," Hope observed, running her fingers along a particularly fine bolt. "From the eastern mills, probably Philadelphia. The weave's tight enough to last decades if it's cared for properly." Martha paused in her counting. "How do you know about textile mills?" "I read about them," Hope replied quickly, "in books." "What kind of books does a frontier girl get hold of that tell her about Philadelphia textile mills?" Hope's hands stilled. "On the fabric. Good books, books that teach you about how things work." It was becoming a pattern, Martha realized. Hope's knowledge was vast but oddly specific, as if she'd been educated by someone with particular interests in commerce and industry. Combined with her obvious familiarity with Millbrook's geography, it painted a picture that didn't quite fit with her story of being a simple orphan from Denver. Meanwhile, Samson continued to prove invaluable around town. The donkey seemed to understand complex instructions, carrying messages between households with reliability that impressed even the most skeptical residents. More remarkably, he appeared to guide Hope to places and people where help was most needed, as if he possessed an uncanny sense for human distress. "That animal's practically human," Dr. Morrison observed after Samson had led Hope directly to the Carson house, where Mrs. Carson was struggling with a difficult pregnancy. "Seems to know exactly where Hope needs to be." Thomas was beginning to suspect that Samson's wisdom might be less supernatural and more practical, the result of careful training by someone who understood both animal psychology and human nature. The question was, who had done the training, and why had they sent Hope to Millbrook with such a perfectly prepared companion? As the sun set on another day of preparation and worry, Thomas found Hope in the corral, brushing Samson's coat with gentle strokes that seemed to calm both animal and girl. The scene was peaceful, domestic in a way that made Thomas's chest tight with unexpected emotion. "Hope," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Whatever brought you here, I'm glad you came." Hope looked up at him with eyes that held more gratitude than any 13-year-old should need to feel. "Me too, Thomas. Me too." But as she turned back to Samson, Thomas caught sight of her expression in the growing twilight. It was the face of someone carrying secrets that weighed far more than any child should bear, secrets that might hold the key to saving everything he'd sworn to protect. The change in Thomas was subtle but unmistakable. Martha noticed it first, the way he lingered when discussing town business, actually listening to suggestions instead of simply nodding politely. Dr. Morrison observed how the sheriff's shoulders seemed less burdened when he made his evening rounds. Even old Pete commented that Thomas had started whistling again, something he hadn't done since Mary's funeral. "That girl's been good medicine for him," Dr. Morrison told Martha, as they watched Thomas and Hope work together to repair a loose. "He bored in the jail's front steps. Hadn't realized how much of himself he'd buried until I saw it coming back to life." Hope had organized the townspeople into work groups, tackling small improvement projects that boosted morale while keeping everyone busy. She seemed to understand instinctively that idle hands led to worried minds, and worried minds led to despair. Under her gentle guidance, Millbrook began to look better than it had in years. Fresh paint on weathered signs, flower boxes appearing on previously bare windowsills, and a general sense that the community was pulling together instead of falling apart. But Thomas also noticed Hope's private moments, the way she would touch her silver locket when she thought no one was watching, her fingers tracing its surface, as if it contained some precious memory. He'd glimpsed the locket once, when sunlight caught it just right, and seen what appeared to be a small photograph inside, though he'd been too far away to make out the details. The nightmares started during their second week together. Thomas would wake to soft sounds from the spare room, not quite crying, but the kind of distressed murmuring that spoke of dreams too painful to forget. When he'd check on her the next morning, Hope would be bright and helpful, showing no sign of her nocturnal struggles, except for the dark circles under her eyes that she tried to hide with cheerful conversation. "Bad dreams?" he asked one morning, setting an extra cup of coffee beside her plate of eggs and bacon. "Sometimes," Hope admitted, wrapping her small hands around the warm cup. "They'll pass. They always do." The matter-of-fact way she said it, as if she'd had considerable experience with nightmares and their eventual departure, troubled Thomas more than tears would have. This was a child who'd learned to manage trauma with the kind of practical stoicism that came from necessity, not choice. Their morning routine had become precious to both of them. Thomas would rise early to tend his small garden, and Hope would appear to help, moving through the rows of vegetables with the kind of careful attention that suggested she'd done similar work before. They would prepare breakfast together, sharing. Comfortable silences punctuated by observations about the weather, the town's needs, or Samson's increasingly obvious intelligence. "He knows things," Hope said one morning, as they watched the donkey systematically sort through a pile of apples, selecting the ripest ones first. "Sometimes I think he understands more than we do. Animals often see what people miss," Thomas replied. "They don't get distracted by what they think they know." Hope glanced at him sharply, as if his words had struck closer to home than intended. "Maybe that's why he chose me instead of the horses. Maybe he saw something everyone else missed." "What do you think he saw?" Hope was quiet for a long moment, stroking Samson's neck as she considered the question. Maybe he saw someone who needed him as much as he needed someone to need him. The wisdom in her observation was far beyond her supposed age, but Thomas was beginning to expect such moments from Hope. She had an old soul, as his grandmother would have said, someone who'd learned life's deeper lessons earlier than most. Their growing bond was tested when the townspeople attempted their first organized fundraising effort. The idea had seemed promising, a community auction where families would donate items they could spare, with proceeds going toward the railroad debt. Hope had helped organize the event with enthusiasm that infected the entire town. The auction raised $347, a respectable sum that would have been celebrated under normal circumstances, but seemed pitiful against the mountain of debt they faced. "It's not enough," Martha said quietly as they counted the meager proceeds by lamplight. "Not even close." "It's a start," Hope insisted, though Thomas could hear the strain in her voice. "There has to be other ways. There has to be." That night, Thomas found Hope sitting on the jail's front porch with tears streaming down her face, the first time he'd seen her cry since her arrival. Samson stood beside her, nuzzling her shoulder with gentle insistence. "Hey now," Thomas said, settling beside her with the careful movements of a man approaching a wounded animal. "It's going to be all right." "How?" Hope asked, her voice breaking. "How is it going to be all right? These people have been nothing but kind to me, and I can't even—" She stopped herself, biting back words that seemed too revealing. "Can't even what?" Hope shook her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Nothing, I just hate feeling helpless." Thomas understood that sentiment better than most. Sometimes being helpless is part of caring, if it didn't hurt to watch. People you love struggle. It wouldn't mean as much when you find ways to help them. But what if there aren't any ways? What if some problems are just too big? Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking about Mary's illness, about all the nights. He'd sat by her bedside, feeling exactly this same crushing sense of inadequacy. Then you do what you can with what you have, and you trust that sometimes that's enough, and sometimes you discover that help comes from directions you never expected. Hope leaned against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that made Thomas's throat tight with emotion. For the first time in 15 years, he felt like someone's father again, responsible not just for keeping the peace, but for nurturing hope in the face of overwhelming odds. "Thomas," Hope said quietly, "if I tell you something, will you promise not to be angry?" "I can't promise not to be angry," he replied honestly, "but I can promise to listen and to try to understand." Hope was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she might have changed her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know more about this railroad situation than I've told you, and I know more about Millbrook than someone who just wandered into town should know." Thomas felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his voice steady. "How much more?" "Enough to maybe help, but I need to be sure about something first. I need to understand whether the people here can be trusted with the whole truth." "Hope, look at me." Thomas waited until she met his eyes. "Whatever the truth is, whatever you're hiding, these people have already proven they can be trusted. They welcomed you without question. They've included you in their struggles, and they've opened their hearts to you. What more proof do you need?" Hope nodded slowly, touching her locket with that familiar gesture. "You're right, I know you're right. I've been disappointed before. By people I thought I could trust. We all have, Thomas replied, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Samson positioned himself at their feet like a guardian, his ears alert to every sound in a quiet street. Whatever secrets Hope was carrying, whatever knowledge she possessed that might help save Millbrook, Thomas sensed they were approaching the moment of revelation. The question was, would the truth prove to be their salvation or their undoing? The discovery came by accident, as the most important discoveries often do. Hope was helping Thomas organize his office, a task that had been postponed for months due to his natural tendency to simply stack papers wherever they landed. She'd proven remarkably efficient at creating order from chaos, sorting documents by date and importance with the kind of systematic approach that continued to surprise him. "What's this?" Hope asked, holding up a yellow document that had been buried. Beneath a stack of wanted posters from 1887, Thomas looked up from his own pile of correspondence and felt a flush of embarrassment. "Old mining survey. Should have thrown it out years ago. Fellow came through in 85, all excited about mineral prospects in the valley. Turned out to be fool's gold and wishful thinking." But Hope was studying the document with an intensity that made Thomas pause in his sorting. Her finger traced the survey lines, her lips moving silently as she read technical descriptions that should have been meaningless to a 13-year-old girl. "This shows ore samples from the eastern ridge," she said, her voice carrying an odd note of excitement. "Silver content, copper traces, even some gold. These are good numbers, Thomas. How do you know what good numbers look like?" Hope's hands stilled on the paper. I've seen surveys before, in books, educational books about mining and geology." It was another of her careful half-truths, Thomas realized, but his attention was caught by something else. "Hope, look at the signature on that survey." Hope examined the bottom of the document, and her face went very still. "J.W. Whitmore, Certified Survey Engineer, Colorado Territorial Authority." "J.W. Whitmore," Thomas repeated. "The banker's brother, the railroad man who used to visit every summer." Hope set the survey down with trembling hands. "Thomas, what if this isn't fool's gold? What if the survey was right, but the mining company never properly explored the sites?" "The mine played out in 90, Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Folks tried every promising spot in these hills, but did they try the sites marked on this survey?" Hope's excitement was building, though she was clearly trying to contain it. "Some of these locations are miles from where the old silver mine was located." Thomas studied the map more carefully, comparing it to his mental picture of the valley's geography. Hope was right. Several of the marked sites were in areas that had never been seriously prospected, either because they were difficult to access or because they lay outside the original mining claims. "Even if there's something there," he said, slowly, "it would take months to explore properly. We've got less than 3 weeks before the railroad deadline." "Not if we know where to look," Hope said, her voice growing more animated. "Thomas Samson could help. He knows these hills better than anyone realizes. I've watched him. He goes places that seem random, but they're not. He's been showing me things." Thomas felt a chill of possibility mixed with skepticism. "Hope, you're talking about a donkey leading us to mineral deposits that professional miners missed." "I'm talking about following leads that were never properly investigated," Hope replied, holding up the survey. "And I'm talking about trusting that sometimes animals know things we don't." Over the next several days, Hope's theory began to seem less far-fetched. When she led Samson to the first location marked on Whitmore's survey, a rocky outcropping 3 miles east of town, the donkey showed immediate interest in a particular section of exposed stone. Hope collected samples according to the survey's methodology, displaying knowledge of geological assessment that she claimed to have learned from educational reading. Dr. Morrison, who had some experience with mineral identification from his medical training, examined the samples with growing amazement. "There's definitely silver content here," he announced to the small group that had gathered in his office. Can't say how much without proper assaying, but it's more than trace amounts. Could be enough to pay off the railroad debt? Martha asked, hardly daring to hope. Could be enough to make this town prosperous for decades, the doctor replied, if the vein runs deep enough. Word of the discovery spread through Millbrook like wildfire, but Thomas urged caution. We can't get everyone's hopes up based on one sample, he warned. And even if there's a fortune in silver up there, we'd need proper equipment, legal claims, and time to extract it. The railroad isn't going to wait for us to become miners. But Hope's confidence was infectious, and her success at the first sight encouraged further exploration. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of the survey's technical language, leading them efficiently to promising locations while avoiding areas that the original prospector had marked as unpromising. It's like she's done this before, old Pete observed, after Hope directed them to a second site that yielded even more encouraging samples. Girls got a feel for the land that most folks take years to develop. Thomas was beginning to have the same thought, though it raised uncomfortable questions about Hope's background that she still refused to answer directly. Her knowledge was too specific, too practical, to have come entirely from books. Someone had taught her these skills, someone with considerable expertise in geology and mining. The third site proved to be the most promising yet. Samson led them to a hidden ravine where water had carved away enough soil to expose a vein of ore that even Thomas's untrained eye could recognize as valuable. Hope's excitement was barely contained as she collected samples, her movements precise and methodical. "This is it," she said, holding up a chunk of rock that glittered with silver deposits. "This is what will save Millbrook." "Maybe," Thomas said, though his heart was beginning to race with possibility. "But Hope, we still have the same problems. Time, equipment, legal procedures." "I know," Hope interrupted, her voice carrying a note of determination that reminded Thomas of herself at her most resolute. "But I also know that sometimes the right knowledge can solve problems that seem impossible." That evening, as they shared a quiet dinner at the jail, Thomas finally asked the question that had been building for days. "Hope, who taught you about geology and mining? And don't tell me it was books. This kind of practical knowledge comes from experience." Hope was quiet for a long moment, her fork pushing food around her plate as she clearly wrestled with how much to reveal. "Someone who cared about me," she said finally. "Someone who wanted me to understand how the world works, especially the parts that most people don't see. Someone in Denver, someone who spent time in many places, someone who understood that knowledge is the most valuable thing you can give a child, because it's the one thing that can never be taken away." Thomas heard the past tense in her words, and understood that whoever had taught Hope these skills was no longer part of her life. The loss explained some of her nightmares, her careful emotional control, and her fierce determination to prove herself worthy of the kindness she'd been shown. "This person would be proud of you," Thomas said gently, "of how you're using what they taught you to help others." Hope's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back with the kind of practiced control that broke Thomas's heart. "I hope so," she whispered. "I really hope so." Outside, Samson could be heard moving restlessly in his corral, as if he sensed the emotional undercurrents flowing through the jail. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Convincing the town to invest their remaining resources in a mining venture, organizing the legal and practical aspects of mineral extraction, and somehow accomplishing in 2 weeks what normally took months. But tonight, as Thomas watched Hope carefully clean and organize her geological samples, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Mary's death, the absolute certainty that he would do anything, risk everything, to protect this remarkable girl who had wandered into his life and changed it completely. The question was, would her knowledge and Samson's mysterious instincts be enough to save them all? Thomas discovered the letters purely by chance, and the discovery changed everything he thought he knew about Hope. She had gone with Martha to help organize a community meeting about the mining prospect, leaving Samson in his corral and her few possessions in the spare room. A sudden mountain storm had blown the window open, scattering papers across the floor, and Thomas had entered simply to prevent further damage. The letters were written on expensive paper with formal letterhead, and they were addressed to Miss Helena Whitmore in elegant script. Thomas felt his hands tremble as he read the first few lines of the topmost letter. "My dearest Helena, your education continues to exceed my highest expectations. Professor Marshall informs me that your understanding of geological principles rivals that of his graduate students, and your facility with commercial law will serve you well in the business world you will inherit. I know the demands I place upon you are considerable for one so young, but you possess both the intellect and the moral character necessary to honor our family's responsibilities." Thomas set the letter down with shaking hands, his mind reeling. Helena Whitmore, not Hope Miller, but Helena Whitmore, which meant she was the niece of J.W. Whitmore, the railroad executive whose survey had been gathering dust in Thomas's office. More than that, she was apparently the heir to considerable business interests and had received the kind of education that explained her sophisticated knowledge. The implications crashed over him like an avalanche. Hope Helena hadn't wandered into Millbrook by accident. She'd come here with purpose, armed with knowledge and resources that could save the town, but she'd also come carrying secrets that cast doubt on everything she'd told him about her. Her background and motivations. When Helena returned from the meeting, chattering excitedly about the townspeople's cautious optimism regarding the mining venture, she found Thomas sitting at his desk with the scattered letters arranged before him. Her face went pale, then settled into an expression of resignation that seemed far too mature for her 13 years. "I can explain," she said quietly. "I'm sure you can," Thomas replied, his voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil in his chest. "Question is whether you will. The truth this time, Helena." The use of her real name seemed to cut through her remaining pretenses. Helena sank into the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of composure that spoke of considerable practice managing difficult conversations. "My name is Helena Whitmore," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "My uncle was J.W. Whitmore, the man who conducted that mining survey. When he died last spring, I inherited his business interests, including partial ownership in the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company." Thomas felt as if the floor had shifted beneath his feet. "You own part of the railroad that's trying to destroy this town?" "A small part," Helena said quickly. "And I had no knowledge of the land seizure proceedings until after they'd begun. My uncle's business partner, my guardian now, handles most of the operational decisions. I only learned about Millbrook's situation when I overheard a conversation about the expansion plans. So you came here to what? Scout the territory for your railroad?" The accusation hit Helena like a physical blow, and tears finally spilled over despite her attempts at control. "I came here because my uncle loved this town," she said, her voice breaking. "He wrote to me about it constantly. The good people, the beautiful valley, the potential he saw for a proper partnership between the railroad and the community. When I learned what was happening, I had to see for myself." Thomas studied her face, looking for signs of deception, but finding only the raw pain of a child who'd been carrying an impossible burden. "Why the false name? Why not just tell the truth from the beginning?" "Because I needed to know what kind of people lived here," Helena replied. "I needed to understand whether you could be trusted with the truth or whether you'd just see me as an opportunity to exploit. I've learned that having money makes people treat you differently, not always better." "And Samson?" Helena smiled through her tears. "Samson belonged to my uncle. He was the only thing I had left of him after the lawyers finished dividing up his estate. Uncle James always said Samson was the smartest animal he'd ever known, and that he understood more about people than most humans did." The pieces were beginning to fit together in Thomas's mind, though the picture they formed was more complex than anything he'd imagined. "The mining survey. Your uncle intended to develop those sites?" He intended to offer the town a partnership, Helena said. Equal ownership in any mineral extraction, with the railroad providing transportation and technical expertise. He believed Millbrook could become prosperous without losing its character. Then why is the railroad demanding the land seizure? Helena's expression darkened. Because my guardian, Mr. Davidson, sees more profit in owning everything outright. He's the one who filed the legal papers, using debts my uncle had originally intended to forgive as part of the partnership agreement. Thomas leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what Helena was telling him. You're saying your own guardian is stealing from the town your uncle wanted to help? I'm saying that sometimes the people who claim to act in your best interests are the ones you need to fear most, Helena replied with bitter wisdom. I've been trying to figure out how to stop him without losing everything my uncle built. Outside, Samson could be heard moving restlessly in his corral, as if he sensed the emotional storm brewing inside the jail. The sound seemed to draw Helena's attention, and she stood to look out the window at her beloved companion. He knows I'm upset, she said softly. Animals always know. Thomas watched her profile in the lamplight, seeing not the mysterious girl who'd captured his heart, but a young woman bearing responsibilities that would challenge someone twice her age. The deception stung, but he was beginning to understand the impossible position she'd been placed in. Helena, he said finally, why didn't you trust me? Why didn't you trust us? She turned back to face him, and in her eyes he saw the accumulated pain of someone who'd learned not to trust easily, because every adult I've ever depended on has eventually disappointed me. Because having power means people want things from you, and it's often hard to tell the difference between genuine affection and calculated interest. And now, Helena was quiet for a long moment, touching the silver locket that Thomas now understood probably contained a photograph of her uncle. Now I think I've found people who care more about doing what's right than about what they can gain. But I'm also terrified that when you learn the whole truth, you'll decide I'm more trouble than I'm worth. Thomas stood and walked around the desk, kneeling beside Helena's chair so they were at eye level. Child Helena, you could never be more trouble than you're worth. You've brought more life to this town, more hope to these people than we've had in years. Whatever else you're hiding, whatever complications your family's business brings, we'll face them together. Helena's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely, and she threw her arms around Thomas's neck with the desperate intensity of someone who'd been alone too long. As he held her, feeling her shoulders shake with suppressed sobs, Thomas realized that his protective instincts had nothing to do with her wealth or connections, and everything to do with the brave, lonely girl who'd chosen a rejected donkey and shown a bitter sheriff how to care again. But even as he comforted her, Thomas's mind was racing with the practical implications of Helena's revelations. If she truly had legal standing to challenge the railroad's actions, if her uncle's original intentions could be proven and honored, then Millbrook might have hope after all. The question was, would Helena's guardian allow his lucrative scheme to be derailed by a 13-year-old girl and a town full of stubborn frontier folk? The revelation came in the form of a leather portfolio that Helena retrieved from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard in Samson's stall. Thomas watched in amazement as she produced document after document, each one bearing the official seal of Whitmore Industries and her uncle's distinctive signature. My uncle kept meticulous records, Helena explained as she spread the papers across Thomas's desk. Every business decision, every plan, every promise he made, he taught me that. Documentation is the difference between intention and action. The first document was a detailed business proposal titled Millbrook Development Partnership and dated just 3 months before J.W. Whitmore's death. As Thomas read, he felt his understanding of the entire situation shift dramatically. Your uncle wanted to make Millbrook a railroad hub, he said, looking up at Helena in amazement. Not destroy it, develop it. He believed small towns were the backbone of America's future, Helena replied. He wanted to prove that progress and preservation could coexist. Millbrook was going to be his demonstration project. The proposal outlined an ambitious but respectful development plan. The railroad would build a proper station and maintenance facility, bringing jobs and commerce to the valley. In return, the town would receive equal partnership in any mineral extraction, guaranteed preservation of its historic buildings, and a permanent fund to ensure local control over future development. This would have made everyone in Millbrook wealthy, Thomas said, scanning the financial projections. Why didn't your uncle present this plan while he was alive? Helena's expression darkened. Because he was sick, and he knew Davidson was already maneuvering to take control of the business. Uncle James wanted to have everything legally secured before revealing his plans. He was protecting both the town and me from Davidson's interference, but he died before he could finalize everything. He died believing I would carry out his wishes when I came of age, Helena corrected. These documents name me as his heir and grant me full authority over all Whitmore Industries properties, including the right to override any decisions made by temporary guardians. Thomas felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. Helena, you're 13 years old. Do these documents actually give you legal standing to challenge Davidson's actions? They do, Helena said firmly. Uncle James was very careful about that. He knew Davidson would try to marginalize me, so he built ironclad protections into every legal arrangement. The only problem is— What? Helena hesitated, her hand moving to her locket. The only problem is that exercising these rights will make me extremely powerful, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility. Thomas studied the young woman before him, seeing past her age to the strength and wisdom that her uncle had recognized and cultivated. Helena, you've been exercising that kind of responsibility since the moment you walked into my office. You've just been doing it quietly, without legal authority to back you up. That's different. Helping organize a mining operation is one thing. Taking control of a railroad company and challenging the business decisions of powerful men, that's something else entirely. Is it? Thomas asked gently. Or is it just the same thing on a larger scale? Helena was quiet for several minutes, studying the documents that represented both her inheritance and her burden. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of resolution that reminded Thomas of his late wife's quiet determination. There's something else, she said, reaching for a document at the bottom of the pile. Something that changes everything. The paper she handed him was a deed transfer, signed and notarized, but never filed with the territorial authorities. Thomas read it twice before the full implications sank in. He deeded the land to the town, Thomas said in amazement. All of it, the entire valley, including the mineral rights. This document grants ownership to the incorporated township of Millbrook, not to the railroad company. Uncle James believed the people who built something should own it, Helena explained. He intended to present this as a gift, along with the partnership proposal. The railroad would have access rights for their line, but the land itself would belong to Millbrook forever. Thomas felt as if he'd been struck by lightning. Helena, do you understand what this means? If this deed is valid, the railroad has no legal claim to seize the land. Their entire foreclosure proceeding is based on fraudulent premises. It's valid, Helena assured him. Uncle James was meticulous about legal procedures, but it's never been filed, which means Davidson doesn't know it exists. As far as he's concerned, the railroad still owns everything. Then we file it immediately. It's not that simple, Helena said, her expression troubled. Filing this deed will expose my involvement and force a direct confrontation with Davidson. He's not just my guardian. He's a powerful man with connections throughout the territorial government. If he chooses to fight me, it could take years to resolve, and he has resources I don't. Thomas understood her dilemma, but his protective instincts were fully aroused now. Helena, you can't let Davidson steal your uncle's legacy and destroy this town just because fighting him might be difficult. I know, Helena replied. but I need to be smart about how I fight him. Uncle James taught me that winning a war sometimes requires losing a few battles first. That evening, as they shared dinner with Martha, Dr. Morrison, and old Pete, the unofficial town council, Helena revealed her true identity and the contents of her uncle's documents. The reactions ranged from shock to anger to bewildered hope. "You mean to tell me," Pete said slowly, "that you're actually the boss of the people trying to throw us off our land?" "I'm the heir to the man who wanted to save your land," Helena corrected. "My guardian is the one trying to steal it." "And this deed," Martha asked, holding the transfer document with reverent care, "this really gives the town ownership of everything?" "Everything my uncle legitimately acquired, which includes most of the valley and all the mineral rights," Helena confirmed. "The only question is whether we can make it stick in court." Dr. Morrison, who had remained thoughtfully quiet throughout the revelations, finally spoke. "Helena, what do you need from us? What can we do to help you honor your uncle's intentions?" "I need you to trust me," Helena said simply. "And I need you to be prepared for Davidson to fight dirty when he realizes what we're doing." "How dirty?" Thomas asked. Helena's expression was grim beyond her years. "Uncle James used to say that desperate men do desperate things. Davidson stands to lose millions if my uncle's real plans come to light. He'll do whatever it takes to prevent that from happening." Outside, Samson could be heard pacing restlessly in his corral, as if he sensed the momentous changes brewing around him. The donkey had been Helena's companion through her uncle's illness and death, her guardian's attempts to control her, and her dangerous journey to a town that might reject her if they learned the truth. Now, as Helena prepared to risk everything to honor her uncle's memory and save the community that had welcomed her, Samson's presence reminded everyone that sometimes the most important journeys are taken not by the powerful, but by the seemingly powerless, and that wisdom often comes in the most unexpected packages. The battle for Millbrook's future was about to begin, and a 13-year-old girl with a stubborn donkey was preparing to take on one of the most powerful railroad companies in the territory. The question was, would courage and justice be enough to overcome wealth and corruption? The arrival of Davidson's advance team shattered the morning calm like a gunshot. 3 well-dressed men in a polished carriage, accompanied by a territorial marshal and 2 railroad security agents, rolled into Millbrook with the confident bearing of conquistadors claiming new territory. Helena watched from the jail's window as they established themselves at the town's small hotel, her face pale but determined. "They're early," Thomas observed, checking his pocket watch. "Weren't supposed to arrive until tomorrow. Davidson always arrives early when he wants to catch people unprepared," Helena replied, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "It's one of his favorite intimidation tactics." Over the past week, Helena had shared more details about her guardian's methods, his tendency to overwhelm opponents with legal paperwork, his skill at finding bureaucratic loopholes, and his willingness to use personal information as leverage. She'd also revealed the full extent of her uncle's business plan, a document so comprehensive and forward-thinking that even Thomas's untrained eye could see its brilliance. The plan wasn't just about saving Millbrook. It was about creating a new model for Western development, one that balanced progress with preservation. J.W. Whitmore had envisioned a network of small towns, connected by rail, but maintaining their individual character, each one proving that growth didn't require the destruction of community values. "Your uncle was more than a businessman, Doctor," Morrison had observed while studying the detailed proposals. "He was a visionary. He was a man who remembered where he came from," Helena had replied. "He grew up in a town that was destroyed by so-called progress. He spent his entire career trying to prove there was a better way. Now, faced with the arrival of those who would destroy that vision, Helena was preparing for the most important battle of her young life. She'd spent hours organizing documents, memorizing legal procedures, and rehearsing arguments with Thomas, playing the role of hostile questioner. Remember, Thomas said as they watched the advance team unload surveying equipment, you don't have to prove everything at once. Just establish your legal standing and present enough evidence to force a delay. A delay won't be enough, Helena replied. Davidson knows I'm here now. He's too smart not to have figured that out. If I don't win decisively, he'll find ways to neutralize me before I can try again. The mining survey had confirmed their most optimistic hopes. The ore samples from all three sites showed commercial-grade silver deposits, with the hidden ravine site indicating a vein rich enough to support decades of profitable extraction. More importantly, Helena's careful research had revealed that the original mining claims from the 1880s had expired due to non-payment of territorial fees, leaving the entire area open for new claims. We've filed proper papers for all the promising sites, Martha reported, her businesswoman's instincts fully engaged. If Helena's deed transfer is validated, the town will own not just the land, but the most valuable mineral deposits in the territory, which is exactly why Davidson will fight so hard to prevent validation, Helena replied. He stands to lose control of assets worth millions. The townspeople had rallied around Helena's cause with a unity that surprised even Thomas. Old Pete had appointed himself her unofficial bodyguard, while Dr. Morrison had volunteered to serve as her medical advisor if stress affected her health. Even the normally cautious banker, Mr. Whitmore, the local brother of Helena's late uncle, had emerged from his usual neutrality to offer support. James always said this town had special people, the banker told Helena privately. I'm beginning to understand what he meant. But Helena's greatest ally remained Samson, whose presence seemed to calm her nerves and focus her thoughts. The donkey had developed an uncanny ability to sense when she needed comfort, appearing at her side during moments of doubt with the kind of intuitive timing that suggested deep understanding. He knows something important is happening, Helena confided to Thomas as she brushed Samson's coat the evening before the confrontation. Animals can sense when the people they love are in danger. Are you in danger? Helena considered the question seriously. Davidson won't hurt me physically. That would create too many complications. But he could make me disappear into boarding schools or private institutions where I'd have no legal recourse. There are ways to neutralize inconvenient heirs without technically breaking any laws. The thought of losing Helena filled Thomas with a protective fury he hadn't felt since Mary's death. Over the past month, this remarkable girl had become the daughter he'd never had, and the idea of anyone harming her activated every protective instinct he possessed. That's not going to happen, he said firmly. Whatever else comes of this confrontation, you're not going anywhere you don't want to go. You can't promise that, Thomas. Davidson has resources you can't imagine. Maybe, but he doesn't have what we have. What's that? Thomas smiled, feeling more confident than he had since this crisis began. He doesn't have a community that loves you enough to fight for you. He doesn't have people who've seen your character and decided you're worth protecting. And he sure as hell doesn't have Samson. As if summoned by his name, Samson pushed his head over the corral fence and nuzzled Helena's shoulder with gentle insistence. The gesture seemed to transfer some of his calm strength to her, and she straightened with renewed determination. You're right, she said. Uncle James used to say that the best business decisions weren't made with money, they were made with heart. Tomorrow we find out if he was right. That night, Thomas found it difficult to sleep. He made several rounds through the town, checking on the families who'd become his extended responsibility, ensuring that everyone understood their role in the next day's proceedings. The unity he saw was remarkable. People who'd been neighbors were now genuine allies, bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. At the jail, Helena was also wakeful, sitting by her window with her uncle's documents spread around her like a shield. She'd changed from the simple frontier clothes she'd worn for the past month into a proper dress that emphasized her education and breeding. The transformation was startling. She looked like exactly what she was, a young woman of considerable intelligence and dignity, prepared to claim her rightful inheritance. Second thoughts? Thomas asked, settling into the chair beside her. Third and fourth thoughts, Helena admitted, but not about whether we're doing the right thing, just about whether I'm strong enough to see it through. You are, Thomas said with absolute conviction. You're your uncle's niece, and you're the girl who chose Samson over the finest horses in the territory. That tells me everything I need to know about your judgment and your courage. Helena smiled, touching her locket one final time before closing her uncle's portfolio. Tomorrow we honor his memory. Tomorrow we save our home, Thomas replied. Outside, Samson settled down for the night with a contented sigh, as if he too understood that the battle ahead would determine not just the fate of Millbrook, but the future of everyone he'd learned to love. The stakes couldn't be higher, but the donkey seemed remarkably calm, perhaps because he'd always known that sometimes the smallest choices lead to the most important victories. The confrontation began at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, in the cramped confines of Millbrook's combination town hall and schoolhouse. Davidson had arrived with an impressive entourage, 2 lawyers, a territorial clerk, and a stenographer, to record every word. He was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of expensive clothing that announced his importance to anyone within eyeshot. Helena entered the hall with Thomas at her side, and Samson trailing behind them. A detail that immediately drew skeptical glances from Davidson's team. She carried her uncle's leather portfolio with the calm dignity of someone who belonged in such proceedings, despite being the youngest person in the room by decades. "Mr. Davidson," Helena said formally, extending her hand with the kind of practiced grace that spoke of careful upbringing. "I'm Helena Whitmore." Davidson's expression shifted from irritation to shock to something that might have been fear, all in the span of a few seconds. "Helena, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be at Miss Crawford's Academy for Young Ladies." "I left Miss Crawford's Academy 3 weeks ago," Helena replied calmly. "I came to fulfill my uncle's final wishes regarding Millbrook." "Your uncle's wishes are irrelevant," Davidson said, recovering his composure with practiced ease. "He's deceased, and I am your legal guardian with full authority over all Whitmore Industries properties. Any decisions regarding this town are mine to make." Helena opened her portfolio and withdrew the first document. Her uncle's official will, notarized and properly witnessed. "Actually, Mr. Davidson, my uncle's will specifically grants me full ownership of all Whitmore Industries assets upon my 13th birthday, which occurred 6 months ago. Your guardianship extends only to my personal welfare, not to business decisions." Davidson's lead attorney, a thin man with sharp eyes, leaned forward to examine the document. Thomas watched his expression change as he realized the implications of what he was reading. "This will appears to be legitimate," the attorney murmured to Davidson. "If it's authenticated, Miss Whitmore does indeed have legal standing to challenge your decisions." "Of course it's legitimate," Helena said, producing a folder full of supporting documentation. "Here are the authentication certificates, witness, statements, and territorial registration papers. Everything was properly filed with the appropriate authorities 6 months ago." Davidson's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Even if you have legal standing, young lady, you're still a child. The territorial courts will never recognize a 13-year-old's authority over business matters of this magnitude." "Actually, they will," Helena replied, producing another document. "Territorial law specifically recognizes inheritance rights at age 13 for individuals who can demonstrate competency in business matters. Uncle James ensured I received the necessary education and certification." Thomas felt a surge of pride as he watched Helena present her case with the kind of methodical precision that would have impressed any courtroom she'd been preparing for. This moment for years, guided by an uncle who'd anticipated every legal challenge she might face. "Furthermore," Helena continued, "I have evidence that your foreclosure proceedings are based on fraudulent premises." She placed the deed transfer on the table, and Thomas watched Davidson's face go from pale to ashen. The railroad executive clearly recognized the document, and its presence in Helena's possession meant his entire scheme was about to collapse. This deed, signed by my uncle and properly notarized, transfers ownership of all Whitmore Industries landholdings in this valley to the incorporated township of Millbrook. The railroad company has no legal right to seize property it doesn't own. Davidson's attorney snatched up the deed, studying it with growing alarm. When was this document executed? 3 months before my uncle's death, Helena replied. It was intended as a gift to the community, part of a comprehensive development partnership that would have benefited both the town and the railroad. This deed has never been filed, Davidson said, seizing on what he thought was a crucial weakness. An unfiled deed has no legal standing, which is why I'm filing it now, Helena replied calmly. As the heir to my uncle's estate, I have full authority to complete any legal transactions he initiated. She handed a completed filing form to the territorial clerk, who examined it with professional attention to detail. Everything appears to be in order, the clerk announced. I'll need to verify the signatures, but assuming authentication, this deed will be officially recorded. Davidson stood abruptly, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. This is preposterous. You can't simply appear out of nowhere and overturn months of legal proceedings with a handful of documents. I'm not appearing out of nowhere, Helena replied with steel in her voice. I'm James Whitmore's niece. I'm the rightful heir to his business interests, and I'm fulfilling the promises he made to this community before his death. If you had honored those promises instead of trying to steal what he intended to give freely, none of this would be necessary. The room fell silent, except for the scratch of the stenographer's pen and the soft sound of Samson shuffling near. The door. Thomas could see the tide turning in Helena's favor, but he also recognized the dangerous look in Davidson's eyes, the expression of a powerful man realizing his carefully laid plans were unraveling. Even if this deed is valid, Davidson said slowly, you still can't prove your uncle's intentions regarding the development partnership. Without his signed authorization for the mining operations, the town has no legal right to extract minerals from the property. Helena smiled, an expression that carried far too much knowledge for her age. Actually, I can prove his intentions. Oh, quite easily. She reached into her portfolio one final time and withdrew a thick folder that Thomas hadn't seen before. Uncle James kept detailed records of every business decision, including his plans for Millbrook. Here are his correspondence with geological experts, his preliminary contracts with mining equipment suppliers, and his detailed financial projections for the partnership he intended to offer this community. But it was the final document that delivered the crushing blow to Davidson's schemes. Helena placed it on the table with ceremonial care, a legal brief bearing the seal of the Territorial Attorney General's office. Most importantly, Helena said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd finally claimed her rightful power, here is Uncle James's formal complaint against fraudulent business practices within Whitmore Industries, filed just 2 weeks before his death. He suspected you were manipulating company resources for personal gain, Mr. Davidson, and he initiated a territorial investigation. Davidson lurched backward as if he'd been physically struck. That's impossible. James never... He couldn't have... He suspected you were using company funds to acquire properties you intended to claim personally, Helena continued relentlessly. The Millbrook foreclosure was just one of several schemes he'd discovered. This complaint requests a full audit of all transactions you've conducted on behalf of Whitmore Industries. The territorial clerk examined the complaint with growing interest. This appears to be a legitimate filing. If the Attorney General's office was investigating Mr. Davidson's business practices, any property transfers initiated during that period would be subject to legal review. Thomas watched Davidson's carefully constructed facade finally collapsed completely. The man who'd arrived in Millbrook with such confidence now looked like what he actually was, a thief who'd been caught with his hand in the till. "You can't prove any of this," Davidson said desperately. "These are just papers, accusations, from a dead man who was clearly not thinking clearly in his final months." "Uncle James was thinking very clearly," Helena replied. "Clear enough to record detailed evidence of your embezzlement, including bank records showing unauthorized transfers and forged authorization documents bearing his signature." She produced one final folder, this one sealed with official territorial markings. "This contains copies of all evidence Uncle James gathered before his death, along with testimony from bank officials who can verify that several major transactions were conducted without proper authorization." Davidson's attorney was frantically shuffling through papers, trying to find some legal foothold that might save his client's position, but Thomas could see the defeat in the man's eyes. Helena had anticipated every possible challenge and prepared. Overwhelming evidence to counter each one. "The Territorial Attorney General will want to review all of this," the clerk announced. "Until that review is complete, I'm placing a legal hold on any property transfers or business decision involving the disputed assets." "Which means," Helena said with quiet satisfaction, "that the railroad's foreclosure proceedings are suspended indefinitely and ownership of the Millbrook properties reverts to the community as my uncle intended." Davidson stood slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "This isn't over, Helena. You may have won this battle, but you're still a child playing in an adult world. There are consequences to challenging powerful people, consequences you may not be prepared to face." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, but before Thomas could respond, Samson took matters into his own hooves. The donkey, who had been quietly observing from near the door, walked deliberately to Davidson's side and delivered a perfectly kick to the man's shin, not hard enough to cause serious injury, but more than sufficient to send him hopping backward with a yelp of surprise and pain. "I think Samson disagrees with your assessment," Helena said, struggling to keep a straight face as Davidson glared at the unrepentant donkey. "He has excellent judgment about people's character." The tension in the room broke as several townspeople struggled to suppress laughter at the sight of the powerful railroad executive being dressed down by a donkey. Even the territorial clerk smiled as he organized the documents that would change. "Millbrook's fate forever, Miss Whitmore," the clerk said formally. "Assuming all these documents are authenticated, and I have no reason to doubt they will be, the township of Millbrook will have clear legal title to all disputed properties, plus full mineral rights and development authority." Helena nodded graciously, every inch the dignified businesswoman her uncle had trained her to become. "Thank you, sir. I believe that's exactly what Uncle James would have wanted." As Davidson and his defeated entourage prepared to leave, Thomas felt a profound sense of completion. The girl who'd walked into his life a month ago had just saved everything he'd sworn to protect, using nothing but courage, intelligence, and the wisdom of a man who'd believed that progress and preservation could coexist. The battle was won, but Thomas suspected the war was far from over. The victory celebration that evening filled Martha's store with laughter and hope that hadn't been heard in Millbrook for years. Helena found herself surrounded by townspeople who alternated between thanking her and marveling at the transformation from mysterious orphan to powerful heiress. But it was the quiet moment when old Pete pressed a small wooden carving into her hands, a miniature donkey he'd whittled himself, that brought tears to her eyes. "For luck," Pete said gruffly, "though I reckon you make your own luck just fine." Thomas watched from across the room as Helena accepted congratulations with the kind of gracious dignity that would have made her uncle proud. She'd saved their town, but more than that, she'd proven that sometimes the most important victories come from the most unexpected champions. Later, as the celebration wound down and people began heading home to their families, Helena and Thomas found themselves alone on the jail's front porch, with Samson dozing contentedly at their feet. The evening air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "So what happens now?" Thomas asked. "You've got a railroad company to run, mineral rights to develop, and a business empire to manage. That's a lot of responsibility for anyone, let alone someone who's 13 years old." Helena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the wooden donkey carving. Uncle James always said that having power meant having the responsibility to use it wisely. "I think the first wise thing I can do is make sure the people of Millbrook have real control over their own future." "What do you mean?" Helena reached into her ever-present portfolio and withdrew a document she'd been working on since the confrontation with Davidson. "I mean, that ownership without participation is just another form of tyranny. I want to establish a community, trust that gives every family in Millbrook an equal voice in how the mineral rights are developed and how the railroad partnership evolves." Thomas studied the document, recognizing the same careful attention to detail that had characterized all of Helena's uncle's work. "You're giving away millions of dollars in potential profit." "I'm investing in something more valuable than profit," Helena replied. "I'm investing in the kind of community Uncle James believed could change how America grows. Millbrook is going to prove that prosperity and preservation can coexist, just like he always dreamed." As if sensing the importance of the moment, Samson stirred from his doze and nuzzled Helena's hand with gentle affection. The gesture reminded Thomas of something that had been bothering him since the confrontation with Davidson. "Helena, that moment when Samson kicked Davidson? That wasn't coincidence, was it?" Helena smiled, scratching behind Samson's ears with obvious affection. "Uncle James used to say that Samson was the best judge of character he'd ever known. He trained him to recognize when people were being threatening or dishonest. The kick was Samson's way of expressing his opinion about Davidson's threats." "Your uncle trained a donkey to be a bodyguard?" "Uncle James trained Samson to be a lot of things, a companion, a protector, a guide to good judgment. He said animals see the truth about people because they can't be fooled by words or appearances." Thomas reflected on his first impression of Samson, stubborn, unrideable, seemingly worthless. Now he understood that the donkey's apparent obstinacy had actually been discrimination. Samson hadn't rejected all riders. He'd simply been waiting for the right person to recognize his true value. "That's why you chose him," Thomas realized. "Not because you were a foolish child who didn't know better, but because you recognized what everyone else had missed." "I chose him because Uncle James taught me to look for worth that others overlook," Helena replied. "He said the most valuable things in life are often the ones that don't announce their importance." The wisdom in her words struck Thomas with unexpected force. Helena herself was living proof of her uncle's philosophy. A 13-year-old girl whose apparent helplessness had masked the power to save an entire community. "There's something else," Helena said, reaching for the silver locket she always wore. With careful fingers, she opened it to reveal not one photograph but two. A distinguished man Thomas recognized as J.W. Whitmore, and beside him, a woman whose eyes held the same intelligent warmth he'd come to associate with Helena. "My parents," Helena explained softly. "They died when I was 7. Uncle James raised me because he said I had their best qualities and their fierce determination to make the world better. What would they think of what you've accomplished?" Helena's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I think they'd be proud that I chose to fight for something bigger than myself, and I think they'd be grateful that I found a family that chose to fight for me." The word family hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither had yet dared to voice. Over the past month, they'd become more than sheriff and ward, more than protector and protected. They'd become what Helena had been searching for since her parents' death and what Thomas had thought he'd lost forever. When Mary died, they'd become father and daughter in every way that mattered. "Helena," Thomas said carefully. "I know you've got responsibilities now, important work to do with your inheritance. But if you're looking for a place to call home while you grow into those responsibilities—" "I'd like that," Helena interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that very much." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear over their saved town, Thomas felt a completeness he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The girl who'd wandered into his life with nothing but hope and determination had given him back his capacity for joy, his sense of purpose, and his faith in the future. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley, but now it sounded like a promise rather than a threat. The railroad would come to Millbrook, but it would come as a partner, not a conqueror. The town would grow and prosper, but it would do so without losing the values that made it worth saving. Samson rose from his comfortable position and walked to the corral gate, as if reminding them that some routines were worth maintaining regardless of how much the world had changed. Helena laughed and stood to tend to her faithful companion, the girl who'd saved a town, taking care of the donkey, who'd helped her find the courage to do it. "Good night, Uncle James," Helena whispered as she settled Samson for the night. "We did it. We kept your promise." And in the gentle mountain breeze that rustled through the valley, Thomas could almost hear the voice of a man who'd believed that sometimes the smallest choices lead to the most profound transformations, and who'd been proven absolutely right. 6 months later, the transformation of Millbrook was remarkable enough to draw visitors from across the territory. The railroad station that J.W. Whitmore had envisioned stood at the edge of town, a handsome building that complemented rather than dominated the landscape. Trains arrived twice daily, bringing supplies, mail, and travelers who marveled at the prosperous community that had somehow managed to embrace progress without sacrificing its soul. The silver mine operated under Helena's revolutionary partnership model, with every family in Millbrook holding equal shares in the profits. The monthly distributions had allowed people to improve their homes, expand their businesses, and invest in their children's education without losing the close-knit bonds that made the community special. Thomas wore his new sheriff's badge with quiet pride, a replacement for the old one that Martha had commissioned from a silversmith in Denver. The engraving read T.W. and H.W. in elegant script, acknowledging the partnership that had saved their town and created their new family. Helena had adapted to her dual life with remarkable grace. 3 days a week, she attended classes at the newly established Millbrook Academy, studying alongside the town's other children and maintaining the friendships that grounded her in normal childhood experiences. The other 4 days, she worked in the small office above Martha's store, managing the complex business affairs of Whitmore Industries, with assistance from carefully vetted advisors who respected both her intelligence and her values. The legal battle with Davidson had concluded with his arrest on embezzlement charges and the complete vindication of Helena's claims. The territorial attorney general had praised her courage in exposing corruption within one of the region's most powerful companies, and several newspapers had written admiring profiles of the girl who saved Millbrook. But it was the smaller daily victories that meant the most to Helena. Watching Dr. Morrison expand his practice with equipment purchased from mining profits, seeing old Pete hire additional help for his increasingly popular saloon, observing Martha's store transform into a proper mercantile that served customers from throughout the valley. Uncle James would be amazed, Helena told Thomas as they reviewed the monthly business reports together. He dreamed of proving that communities could prosper without losing their character, but I think even he would be surprised by how well it's working. He'd be proud of you, Thomas replied, studying the financial projections that showed sustained growth for decades to come. You've honored his vision and made it better. Samson remained the town's unofficial mascot, beloved by children and adults alike for his gentle wisdom and uncanny ability to appear wherever he was needed most. He'd grown sleek and healthy under the community's care, but his greatest joy remained his daily routine with Helena, morning brushing sessions where she shared her plans and concerns with the patient donkey who'd helped her find her courage. The test of their new life came when another lost child arrived in Millbrook, a 10-year-old boy named Jeremy, whose parents had died in a mining accident near Denver. Thomas found him sleeping in the livery stable, thin and scared, and clutching a bundle of possessions that told the familiar story of sudden orphanhood. Helena was in her office when Thomas brought Jeremy to the jail, but she appeared within minutes, drawn by the same instincts that had guided her to help the townspeople 6 months earlier. The boy looked up at her with the kind of desperate hope that Thomas remembered from their first meeting. "Hello," Helena said gently, kneeling to Jeremy's eye level. "I'm Helena, and this is Thomas. We're very glad you found your way to Millbrook." "I don't have anywhere else to go," Jeremy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The people at the orphanage said I could work for food, but you wanted a home, not just work," Helena finished, understanding immediately. "That makes perfect sense. Everyone deserves a home." Thomas watched the interaction with a mixture of pride and amazement. Helena had transformed from a frightened girl seeking shelter into a young woman capable of offering comfort to others who'd faced similar losses. The change wasn't just in her circumstances, it was in her soul. "Are you hungry?" Helena asked Jeremy, who nodded eagerly. "Good. Thomas makes excellent pancakes, and Samson, that's my donkey, loves meeting new friends." As Helena led Jeremy toward the kitchen, chattering about the town's children and the school he could attend, Thomas felt the same sense of completion he'd experienced 6 months earlier. Their family was growing again, shaped not by blood, but by choice and love, and the understanding that sometimes the most important relationships are the ones that save you when you need saving most. That evening, as Jeremy slept soundly in the spare room that had once housed Helena, the three of them sat on the front porch, with Samson dozing nearby. Helena was teaching Jeremy to whittle, using the same patient encouragement that Thomas had shown her during their early days together. "Think he'll stay?" Thomas asked quietly. "I think he'll stay as long as he needs to," Helena replied, guiding Jeremy's small hands as he shaped a piece of pine wood. "And when he's ready to make his own choices about where he belongs, we'll support whatever he decides." It was the kind of wisdom that came from experience, the understanding that love meant providing security without demanding ownership, offering guidance without controlling outcomes. Helena had learned these lessons from her uncle, from Thomas, and from Samson, and now she was passing them on to another child who needed to know that families could be chosen as well as born. In the distance, the evening train whistled as it approached the station, carrying passengers and mail and the products of their thriving community to markets across the territory. The sound that had once threatened their existence now represented connection and opportunity, proof that progress and preservation could indeed coexist when guided by wisdom and compassion. Helena touched her locket one final time, thinking of the uncle who'd taught her to see value where others saw worthlessness, the parents who'd given her the courage to fight for what mattered, and the town that had welcomed her when she needed family most. Samson stirred from his doze to nuzzle her shoulder, the gentle donkey who'd helped her understand that sometimes the most important journeys begin with the smallest steps. "Thank you," she whispered, to her uncle, to her parents, to Thomas, to Samson, and to the community that had proven that love multiplies when it's shared freely. "Thank you for teaching me that home isn't a place. It's the people who choose to care for each other." Above them, stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, watching over a town that had learned to honor both its past and its future. Guided by the wisdom of a girl who'd chosen a rejected donkey and discovered that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships create the most extraordinary transformations. In Millbrook, the smallest choices had indeed changed everything, and the changes would ripple outward for generations to come, carried by the children who'd learned that family is built on love. that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes a stubborn donkey is exactly the guide you need to find your way home.